All right. Welcome, everybody, to the Satellite Book Club Seminar Series number 222. My name is Dan Lindsay with NOAA NESDIS. Today's presentation is the New York City flash flooding event from 29 September of 2023, a successful collaboration from outlooks to warnings. Our presenters are Dave Riddell from Weather Service New York City, as well as Andrew Orison from the Weather Prediction Center. And our facilitator is Heather Kenyon, who is the meteorologist and satellite focal point from the Buffalo office. I'd like to remind everybody that this session is being recorded per the OCIO Privacy Act guidelines. Please keep your microphone muted and your webcam off throughout the session. You can see the pinned message in the chat for more information on that. There will be a Q&A section after the presentation. I'd like to encourage attendees to post their questions in the chat room and they'll be fielded there. If you're logged in under an alias account, please sign in with your full name or specify your full name whenever you're asking a question in the chat. We're always looking for future presenters in Satellite Book Club, so please contact the Tower S team if you're interested in presenting on really anything. The training team can help create training materials that may be unavailable. Contact Ross Van Til for information or questions about that. Big thanks to the OCLO, the GEO-LEO programs, and our facilitator, Heather Kenyon. Okay, so I'm going to give a quick introduction to our two speakers and then hand it off to them, and we'll go from there. So Dave Riddell has been at the WFO New York since June of 2019 after spending more than a decade at the Eastern Region headquarters and their Scientific Services Division. In that capacity, he served as the Regional Satellite Program Leader and, along with Operations Proving Ground, helped spearhead the first formal WFO evaluations of the GOES fog and low stratus test products in 2012 and 2013. As well as the initial GOES Mesoscale window request process. Dave enjoys challenges of forecasting weather in the Northeast at the busy office that serves almost 20 million people. His areas of interest include probabilistic forecasting techniques, forecast verification, satellite meteorology, and the integration of good science into impact decision support services. Andrew Orison has been a forecaster at WPC since 2001 after spending nearly 3 years working for the Satellite Analysis Branch, or SAB. He's the MetWatch program lead and satellite focal point at WPC and helps train forecasters on integrating LEO and geo-based satellite data sets into the forecast decision-making process with an emphasis on providing impact-based division support services. His interests include mesoscale meteorology with an emphasis on flash flood forecasting, as well as satellite meteorology and probabilistic forecasting techniques, including the interrogation of AI, ML-based models and tools. So welcome back to Satellite Book Club. And welcome Andrew back to Satellite Book Club, and welcome everybody. And please take it away. I'm going to go on mute now.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, Dan. Appreciate the introduction there. So this first slide here, so you can see the pictures in the background there. And so this was really, unfortunately, a pretty high impact flash flood event that hit on September 29th, 2023. In New York City. These are actually pictures that you're seeing here from the Brooklyn vicinity, and you can just see the inundation that actually occurred from that particular event. And so this talk will go ahead and get into how things panned out for the event. And if we can go to the next slide there, we'll go ahead and just kind of show the outline for this. And so we'll go ahead and have essentially an event summary and a rainfall analysis of what occurred up there. We'll go ahead and get into the different phases of the event, the outlook phase ahead of the heavy rainfall event. We'll talk about the watch and warning phase as well. And then we'll talk about WPC's MetWatch desk and some of the IDSS that we provided with this, certain products, the MPD in particular that was issued for this event. And we'll also get into some satellite recommendations, and there'll be multiple satellite animations that you'll see in this talk as we proceed forward. So next slide. Okay, so tough media for New York City, no warning. Dave, I'm not sure that's exactly how things panned out up there. So you tell me what happened.
I know, right? And you see the second bulletin there. The mayor praises the city's response, right? So, this is not what you want to see after working, a 12+ hour event. We've had no shortages over the last couple of years of flash flood emergency level events. This was not one of those events, although certainly impactful for the city. And this was actually an event that was well collaborated, really, between WPC, our office, and certainly our neighbors to the south at Mount Holly as well. So wanted to share some of that with you today. Next slide, please. All right, so big question mark. We'll see what you think. Here's a couple of shots here. That middle shot perhaps is the most striking one. That's the baggage claim at LaGuardia Airport at some point on that Friday morning. So people, taking off and are coming back into the city and having to trudge through that on their way back home. But this was another event that was somewhat widespread, but did not encompass the whole city. So you compare this to something like the Ida event from a couple years earlier, where you basically had the entire city plus the outskirts inundated. This was a little more localized in terms of impacts and in terms of some of the rainfall that we'll get to in a minute. But here you can see certainly impactful on the nuisance to maybe a little more than nuisance plus in terms of impacts. Okay, next slide. All right, so just kind of an overview of the process here that went through meteorologically. WPC had issued a marginal risk on day 4. That was upgraded to a slight on day 2, and then a moderate risk a little bit later on day 2. So this is the day before. And anytime we get into a slight and moderate risk, in coordination with WPC, that sends into effect a whole bunch of cascading stuff for our office. In this case, up to and including sending a meteorologist down to the New York City Office of Emergency Management, which we did for this particular event, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. Flood watch went up along with the moderate risk on the afternoon the day before, and then as we get into the event, our office issued 12 flash flood warnings, including 2 of those which were of the considerable impact-based warning tag, and obviously do the WIAs. The event really went on for a good 10 to 12 hours. So it was a pretty long duration in terms of how long this thing lasted. And, lead time for our warnings in this case was pretty good. I was one of the 2 warning operators that day, and Andrew worked some of the Met Watch of this as well. So both of us have sort of a connection to this event. Next slide. Question mark. All right, so taking a look at some of the data, the image on the left is the New York City micronet, which is part of the New York State mesonet. And one of the things that maps that they produce for us are peak hourly rainfall rates. And so you can see kind of around the city there, the peak 1 hour rainfall rate over the life of the event was over 3 inches, which is pretty good. You see a bunch of 2s there kind of up towards Manhattan and sort of the western part of Queens, northern part of Brooklyn. But you can see as you go out from that, less than 1 inch an hour for some of those spots. So in terms of localization, this was really the southern part of Brooklyn, southern part of Queens, and kind of up into a little bit of Midtown that were mostly impacted by this particular event. You look at the storm total map that we produced based on our observational data. You had a widespread 6 to 8 inches kind of along that corridor. Even into parts of, even a little bit further east into parts of Nassau County there, and then extending on up into parts of southern Connecticut. So again, you compare this with some other events, it was a little more localized in terms of those heaviest rainfall rates and the impacts as well. Next slide. And just another shot of this again, kind of the widespread, those pinks there from the MRMS Q3 showing more than 5 inches of rain. You can see pretty widespread between Nassau County, Queens, Brooklyn, and then up kind of along the eastern side of Manhattan up into the Bronx, and then up across the I-95 corridor. And, ARI-wise, this was a 50 to 100-year event, roughly speaking, based on the QPF. So certainly impactful, but certainly also not the end of the world kind of event that we've seen in other instances there as well. Next slide. Okay, so putting this sort of into perspective, if we take a look at one of the topics our office has been looking at over the last couple of years with this advent of a bunch of instrumentation from the mesonet and the micronet that we have, is these 5-minute rainfall rates. So basically these sub-hourly, sub-15-minute rainfall rates. And what we sort of noticed is that when you start to get these 5-minute observations that are more than about 0.3, 0.4, 0.5 inches in 5 minutes, those tend to separate out the impactful events, i.e. a considerable or a catastrophic level flash flood event, from some of the more garden variety of flash flood events that you have. And if you look at the left column, you'll see for Mapleton and Brooklyn, these are New York State mesonet sites of 5-minute rainfall. The red is the accumulative value, and those blue bars show kind of the 5-minute rainfall rate. You can see there that, we had a period of about an hour to an hour and a half of those heaviest rates for this particular event from the 29th. If you look to the right-hand side, in comparison to post-tropical depression Ida from 2021, and then the state record from 2014, you can kind of see the difference in terms of those hourly rates and the duration. So that left column showing the 29th event, that right column showing really the higher end events that we've had, the true flash flood emergency type events that we've had. And you can see both in terms of the magnitude and the duration of that magnitude really don't compare for this event. So, the considerable tags seem to be pretty in line with what we were seeing on the ground at the time, and certainly on the rainfall rates there as well. Next slide. Okay, and I'll hand it back to Andrew to talk about some of the lead up to the event.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Dave. And so, yeah, from an excessive rainfall outlook perspective, as David mentioned, we actually had a marginal risk on day 4. So even in the medium range period, we were, kind of highlighting the potential for there being an event around the New York City area. And then that carried over into day 3. And we just had a marginal risk, even on September 27th there during the afternoon. That was the updated day 3 ERO. And relatively broad in nature. You can sort of see how it went up the coast a little bit there in the southern New England, but also down to the south through southern New Jersey. So trying to account for some of the uncertainty that was in play at that time, especially with some of the guides. I remember the NBM did have some relatively heavy amounts, but there was a lot of uncertainty with just how the details were going to play out with this. And it was really when we started getting the HREF guidance, that's the high res, convectionality model suite. That's when conditions really started to look more impressive for there being a higher end type of event. And it was the initial HREF run that came in the very early morning hours of September 28th on our night shift here, where we did see signals showing up here. You can see on the left some of the probabilistic output from the HREF kind of showing that we were getting some higher potential for 1 inch per hour rates, and also seeing some persistence of those rates as well. You could see like the neighborhood probability for getting 8 inches in 12 hours. You're starting to see some signals there pretty close to New York City itself, and down the coast a little bit in New Jersey. And then the idea of getting potentially a 100-year ARI event, which, pretty much any time you start seeing that kind of signal in the HREF, then you're kind of thinking, all right, well, this has the concern of being a higher end flash flood event potentially. So we upgraded to a slight risk, as you can see there with that initial day 2 ERO. And in the discussion too, we were even mentioning how in this case we were getting concerned about there being a higher end threat. So we just had a lot of confluence of signals from the guidance, not to mention some of the conditions meteorologically that were kind of pointing toward a bigger event. So next slide. And so this here was actually going with the 12Z HREF guidance there on the 28th. So when we had that next iteration, that next cycle of guidance, we went ahead and contemplated the idea of upgrading to a moderate risk, and that's exactly what we ended up doing after we saw a lot of the probabilistic data, as you can see on the left there, that came in from the HREF. A lot of enhanced probabilities of getting high rates, 1 to 2 inch per hour rainfall rates, and also seeing potentially a lot of persistence of that's going to lead to some pretty heavy totals there. You can see the neighborhood probability for 8 inches in 12 hours. And we saw these probabilities increase from the previous cycle. And so that really led us to go ahead and suggest to WFO Upton that we would go ahead and go with a moderate risk. We had a conference call with OKX that day, and Dave remembers that quite well. And it was a really good collaboration to go ahead and get the messaging out for a higher impact event, moderate risk in this case, and then ultimately leading to the issuance that you can see with the flood watches. And so Dave, go ahead and as we go to the next slide there, go ahead and talk us through some of the watch and warning phase for the event.
Yeah, so that starting after that upgrade on the afternoon of the 28th, we kind of went into full mode of the higher end event. We made arrangements for one of our staff to head down early the next morning to New York City OEM. and for an on-site deployment for this. And we also started, at this point, we're as opposed to, social media kinds of things, we're actually starting initial briefings, which we started the afternoon of the 28th and then continued on for at least one more cycle on that overnight shift. Interestingly, here it seems like we never have just one thing going on. We also had coastal flooding at the same time. So we're kind of watching two different things related to this particular event. And, at the time we're having discussions about whether or not some of the coastal flooding can limit drainage around, which we've seen before. And so if you get those really high rainfall rates during high tide, you can actually have some of these lower areas in and around the city become inundated a little bit quicker. So these are all the discussions that we're having internally, and then this is what we're showing externally in terms of our messaging for this particular event. We're talking about rainfall rates, rainfall amounts, and the potential for river and coastal flooding, in addition to the excessive rainfall. Next slide. So once we issue basically our first flash flood warning in the middle of the night. Right there, you can see in green, this will take about 30 seconds to go through, but you can see as the morning wears on, this is about a 10 or 11 hour radar loop here, but focus your eyes on the center of that screen with the orange concertable box, and you'll see just the very narrow band of focus of the convection really just kind of fire hosing right over the city. And that goes on and on and on, for a good amount of time there. And so in terms of the localization, again, which I sort of mentioned before, it's really that, Queens into Brooklyn and up the I-95 corridor into Westchester County and up into Connecticut that really is the main area that we are concerned with that particular morning. All right, next slide. We, at the time, and I'll show the 1 minute sandwich here in a minute, that you can let that play, and you can stare at that and again see the convergence along with a really good southeasterly flow advecting moisture up into the area. Let that play again if you don't mind. At the same time, we are discussing with our meteorologist who's deployed at New York City Emergency Management. He is helping us with real-time observations on the ground. And so in terms of what's coming into NYCM and helping us make decisions about whether or not upgrades were needed or not based on what we were seeing radar-wise, satellite-wise, and what they were seeing on the ground with respect to real-time observations, camera information, everything they have around the city. So we were using him as the deployed person to help us on the ground make decisions about IBW upgrades for the flash flood warnings, which worked out really, really well. But you can see here again with a 1 minute, this is the mesosector that's over us. Again, you can see the differential motion in these clouds and just a really nice southeast flow advecting that moisture up into the area. Next slide here. I know we have a lot of fans on here of some of the blended products that both polar and geo, and one of the ones that we certainly like to use is the blended total precipitable water. I don't know if you can make that play, but you'll notice once you start getting into those magentas, those oranges, reds, and magentas, that's the telltale sign of 2+ inch PWatts, advecting into your region. And so you can see, although it's a little choppy, at least on my end here, those values kind of skirting right up the coast and on into the New York City area in advance of the upper system. But, as Andrew will show in a little while, kind of focused along an inverted trough that was hanging out over the area for this morning. Next slide. We'll turn it back to Andrew for some of the MetWatch real-time DSS that WPC was providing for us and others.
Okay, yeah, thanks there, Dave. Yeah, so the MetWatch desk going into this event, so I was actually working that night, and had actually already issued one MPD prior to this one to try to capture that first warning that David mentioned there that happened in the middle of the night. But the conditions really were ramping up quite extensively in the early morning hours there. So around about 5:05 a.m., I put out this latest MPD here, and the idea was to really kind of ramp up the messaging. So it was quite clear that New York City was going to be hit by a pretty high impact event certainly from a rainfall perspective. And so the idea here was to kind of just highlight the general area here. This is the graphic you see on the left there, the scalloped area, just kind of highlighting the overall threat area there. But then you can see in the green, I've specifically mentioned how New York City itself and some of the adjacent suburbia are going to be in line for some pretty heavy rainfall totals. And the idea here too was the message, flash flooding likely scenario, talking about New York City itself, and the I-95 corridor, kind of running southwest to northeast across the region. But it was also to try to get the WFO on board with some of this messaging here. So we wanted to go ahead and tell OKX that we were especially concerned about some very high rainfall totals and getting into some pretty sensitive areas. The population centers around New York City. And so we went ahead and put out the MPD, and this was a setup too. I mean, just meteorologically, there was just a lot going for it from an efficiency perspective. The rainfall efficiency was quite high. We had a lot of tropical moisture that was in play here. A lot of ingredients with a front nearby. A lot of strong moisture convergence into that boundary, getting overrunning with it. There was still remember quite strongly how frontogenetic everything looked for the event as well. And you just had a lot of ingredients coming together that was going to favor this heavy rainfall event. But trying to get all the information, I mean, in this case here, it's all about, kind of pulling, a combination of GEO and LEO satellite data sets. In this case here, this is a proxy viz satellite image that I actually had used for the graphic. But behind the scenes, I was looking at a lot of LEO analysis. And if you can go to the next slide there, some of the experimental Sierra products that are out there available through John Forsyth and his group, along with Sheldon here, really proved to be quite pivotal in being able to assess, kind of the setup and just how impactful a rainfall event this was going to be. And in this case here, I made specific mention about the layered vapor transport. This is an experimental product with Sierra there, where you can kind of look at the different layers of the column. You can see how you're getting that moisture transport in the various columns. And in this case, in the top left and the top right in particular, so like the surface to 850 and 850 to 700 millibar layers, if you look offshore there, off the East Coast, you actually see some enhancement in the vapor transport there. And it actually is advecting off to the west northwest with time there. And you could sort of get a sense with the large scale pattern that it was kind of getting caught up between two features. There was an upper level ridge to its north, and you also had this upper trough that was digging in across the Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley. So you had a bit of a squeeze play going on there, where you had this corridor of enhanced moisture that was caught offshore, and then was getting pulled back off to the west northwest and right into the greater New York City metropolitan area. Go to the next slide. So this is another experimental data set, which I love looking at here. And I'm glad Sheldon's on here today with us. And I saw his links that he posted in the chat there. That's for some additional perspective on this event. But in this particular case, this data set here, the idea was to try to see where there might be a bit more of an anomalous pooling of moisture in the different layers. And you can sort of see a little bit in the surface to 850 layer there in the top left, a little bit of enhancement in this loop that gets kind of concentrated around New Jersey, Long Island, around New York City itself. The other layers are not necessarily as as obvious as far as anything that's too anomalous. But given the time of the year though in which this occurred, I mean there was certainly plenty of moisture though that was in place, and at least in the lower levels, it was rather anomalous for sure, and it's kind of contributing to those higher PWs. Go to the next slide. What was really interesting, sort of from a post-mortem perspective, and during the event, I didn't even think about any kind of tropical connection as far as like a tropical cyclone was concerned. I remember doing the MPDs, and I didn't even mention anything about Ophelia. But you might recall that the tropical storm Ophelia had made a landfall several days prior to the New York City event. It was about 6 days before. And the track of that storm ended up coming up into the mid-Atlantic region, but then its remnants went offshore, and you could sort of see how the moisture that was associated with that really kind of got tapped and was pulled back to the west northwest. And it certainly seems as if there was some DNA, if you will, from Ophelia that, from a moisture perspective, got pulled back into this event for New York City, and that's what the Sierra products were showing. Showed that layer vapor transport product, and it showed that quite clearly that the moisture that was offshore was getting advected back toward the toward the coast. And again, it was a case where you had this trough digging in across the Ohio Valley and the ridge up to its north, and kind of a squeeze play with the blocking pattern there, pulling the moisture inland. And that because of that, this is where you had that greater efficiency, with the heavier rainfall rates and the overall storm totals that occurred. Next slide. Okay, and so the setup, so this was at 12Z, and so the MPD was already out for much of southern New England and the greater New York City areas. But you can see here from the 12Z WPC surface analysis, you can see this inverted trough that kind of extends northward up along the mid-Atlantic coast there. We had a wave of low pressure that was just offshore of the Outer Banks, but because of that inverted trough and with some of the frontogenetical forcing that was going on with that, we had the moisture transport and just had a lot of ingredients coming together that was favoring the longevity of that rainfall event through the warning hours. You could see the precipitable water values that were pretty high, getting up over 1.75 inches right offshore, but it was all being advected towards Long Island. And this was a case where you just had really strong convergence. The instability part was not necessarily that impressive, but when you have a lot of forcing through the column and you've got really good rainfall efficiency, you don't necessarily need a lot of instability for there to be heavy rainfall rates and heavy rainfall totals. If you do have the instability, that can be a bonus for sure, but this is a case where you were really saturated pretty much all the way up through the column there, and so you just had a lot going for it from a rainfall efficiency perspective. Next slide. Okay, so later that morning, so my colleague Rich Otto actually put out this MPD, and this was following the one I had where it went ahead and expired, but the conditions were worsening on the ground. We already had a lot of flash flood warnings at this point. There were multiple considerable tags, as Dave had mentioned. Those were out at this time. And in this case here, looking at the satellite image, you could kind of see a little bit of a sort of a convective wedge signature there, sort of like a V notch near New York City itself there. And so you had an environment where it was quite divergent aloft. And you might recall I mentioned that upper trough that was over the Ohio Valley. So the flow aloft was quite divergent, and that in conjunction with everything going on in the low levels with the moisture convergence and the inverted trough axis there really just set the stage for continuing the environment for heavy rainfall and getting in this case here having that threat persist even going into the afternoon hours. Next slide. Okay, so you can go ahead and play this here, and again, tip of the hat to Sheldon there. He actually put the links for the ALPW before the event, during the event, and even afterwards, relative to New York City and just how this all played out. But I wanted to show this because the Sierra ALPW 4 panel, which we have in AWIPS, is really great for assessing a lot of different meteorological features, a lot of different details that could be of interest. And it's even more than just looking at the moisture itself. We know that the source regions for the moisture are kind of key to the rainfall efficiency. But when you look at the different layers, you can also kind of see where you might have potential forcing mechanisms, and it can be useful for identifying a lot of different types of things like fronts, other parts of the country. You can use the ALPW product to identify dry lines, and also short waves, short and long wave troughs, and if there's any other types of mesoscale features, like if there is a tropical cyclone, I mean, it's perfect for that. But also like MCV. So let's say you have a leftover convective complex, you have an MCV that's left behind. Sometimes the ALPW can be really good in just showing the remnants of that feature, which could go ahead and potentially be another focus for convection and heavy rainfall at a later time. So a lot of utility with the Sierra ALPW product. Okay, so I think our final slide is coming up here next. And I talked about the ALPW products, including the experimental Sierra products. And Dave, what else do you can you think of here when it comes to satellite recommendations?
This is, we Andrew and I kind of talked about this a little bit and put together some, borrowing from some others and, putting some things together about some recommendations, for these excessive rainfall types events. When you get towards the warning phase, the first thing, call a mesosector. We didn't have to do this that day, as the default is usually over us, so that worked out pretty well. But go through your regional rocks and make that mesosector request. The 1 minute data is certainly a fantastic addition for mesoanalysis and things like that when you're in real time. Additional satellite products in terms of looking at instability and things like that. The PWATS, we have a ton of stuff in AWIPS or out of AWIPS depending on your situation. The blended TPW, the percent of normal that are in AWIPS buried in the satellite menu, if you can find those. The layered ALPW, which we have here as well. Air mass RGB, and all these other sorts of satellite-based products that even with a mesoanalysis focus can kind of help you put the picture together, as you're approaching or once you get into, your warning operations. So, and then finally, Andrew mentioned these. We did not use these the day of, but the percentile rankings, which is kind of cool when you think about it, that now you get sort of a CLIMO perspective, right, for some of this information as well. So, really neat stuff to take a look at, as you're in that mesoanalysis and into warning operations as well. So just we'll leave you with some of those recommendations that we kind of came up with based on this and other events that Andrew and I have worked seemingly in tandem over the years. So with that, we'll turn it back to Heather.
All right. Well, thank you, Dave and Andrew. That was a great presentation and a great slide with a lot of good recommendations for meteorologists out there. I'd like to ask everyone on the call to please stay on for discussion. We encourage participation from field offices, and regional headquarters. We also encourage everyone to change their meeting layout to tiled. You can see the slide there, and select hide tiles without video. Emily will be posting a message about a survey in the chat room, so please fill that out if you have any feedback. And everyone, just please submit their questions in the chat. And if you'd like to verbally ask the question, just mention that in the chat, and we'll do our best to accommodate that. So next week on Thursday, February 13th at 12 p.m. Eastern Time, Kevin Thiel, research meteorologist from CRO and GOES-R satellite liaison to SBC and NOAA's HWT, will discuss satellite demonstrations from May 21st, 2024 during the hazardous weather test bed of 2024. And please contact the Tower S team, Kashad Bauman and Emily Maddox, for questions about the Satellite Book Club and or for configuration of satellite products. Okay, so let's get started. So Dave and Andrew, this was a major event in a major metropolitan area. So it's definitely one to look back on. As a meteorologist myself, I got a lot of recommendations from satellite-based things, but also collaboration. So this was a well-forecast event, but still there's a lot of takeaways. So just to start off with a question, Dave, how common or rare is it to get a flood of this magnitude? I know you said that this wasn't necessarily an extreme event. However, the ARIs did display a 50 to 100 year, but from your experience, how common is this in the tri-state area?
Yeah, I mean, we've had just in the last, I think since Ida, including Ida, which was 2021, I believe we've had 4 emergency level flash flood events. Obviously, this one was not included, including 2 just this past August. We've had, they seem to come in swarms almost. You look back at the 2014 event that was out here out on Eastern Long Island. If that had been, 30 miles to the west, that would have been extremely problematic, 50 miles to the west. So it seems like, we're in a period right now where we are getting one of these a year, one of these every couple of years of like 100-year plus. And so that's what we've noticed the last couple of years. And so, a lot of these tools, we've gotten a lot of at-bats with a lot of these tools, which was, as I like to say, which has been kind of nice. So, thanks to everybody that's the developers out there that know that your stuff is being used, even if, it's not always obvious. And so, forums like this allow us to kind of share some of that stuff. But at any rate, we've certainly had no shortage of those, and over the last 5 to 6 years, we've had our share of emergency level events, and including several considerable-ish events as well, including the one that we showed today.
Okay, and I feel like in my experience with heavy precipitation events, for whether it's rain or snow, when you have collaboration from national centers and your neighbors, you can really add to your confidence to increase amounts in your products. As you showed in one of the slides, your first, I think, one-page briefing had amounts up to 5 inches of rainfall, localized amounts, of course. So can you discuss the nature of your collaboration on that day? I know the slides, talked a lot about that, but was it unusual? Was it more collaboration than usual, or less, or how would you compare it to?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think what we've learned, and I won't speak for our neighbors, but I think our neighbors to the south, particularly Mount Holly and Boston to the north, I think we've gotten a lot more proactive as a group, and collaborating with WPC or whoever the national center is further on out in time, prior to the event, to try to get the messaging out a little bit earlier. I think that's one, even before we would have traditional watch and warning products out, and probabilistic information is helping us a little bit with that. But the challenge that remains really in a lot of these events is when you have a briefing that shows up to 5 inches of rain. What does that mean to an individual or somebody who is preparing for that information? And B, in these types of events, right, if you're on the west side of Manhattan, you're sort of saying there's nothing to see here, right? Or if you're out in Suffolk County or up in other parts in and around the Tri-State. So these localized high rainfall rate events are a challenge to message, because somewhere is going to get this, but not everybody. And so trying to tease out that kind of the preparedness piece of that is a very difficult, challenging message challenge that we do have. And we've learned from several of these events that we haven't quite found the right balance of that yet. But I think big picture wise, as a group of offices up in this area, along with the national centers, we've tried to be more proactive, longer out in time, of highlighting these potentials. And I think that's one real good success that we've had certainly over the last few years, if not a little bit longer than that.
Yeah, I agree completely. Andrew, do you have anything to add?
No, I think Dave covered that very well. I mean, I think from a national center perspective, especially when we're talking about an upgrade in our categories, like in this case, we went up to a slight and ultimately up to a moderate risk within a span of about 36 hours, and having those conversations back and forth, whether it's in the AWIPS chat or even in particular, with Google Meet in this case, which we did. I mean, that really helps to get everyone on the same page for the messaging, and we can have that conversation about how the event may play out. So this was really a good success story, especially with the moderate risk that we have put out there, and getting the WFOs on board. Not only just with the setup, but then like how we're going to message this, and even the rocks as well. The Eastern Region Rock, in this case, would have been involved with some of those coordinations as far as the potential for watches and so forth. So it's all a team approach when it comes to this.
And one thing to add to this too, it was after we had that afternoon WPC call that we had made the decision here to send somebody down to deploy one of our incident meteorologists down, one of our deployment ready meteorologists down to New York City Emergency Management to have them there that day, which really was invaluable for us here during warning operations. But really it was the collaboration leading up to that helped in that decision. And so that's another aspect of it. I think that's kind of important too, as we evolve as an agency and we're doing this more frequently, having that consistent message, that consistent idea from top to bottom, in making these decisions certainly helps as well.
Yeah, and I'm sure most of your on-site deployment are for events that are planned outdoor events. Like this is something probably on the rare side where you're doing it just based on, your forecast of the potential for this. And going back to the HREF probability, the slide with the neighborhood probability images, it did look like the bullseye, maybe day 2, day 3 out was more so across northern New Jersey on the west side of where actually the rainfall occurred, the localized heavy rainfall. But I saw in your slight risk, you actually included all of southern Connecticut and Long Island, even though the HREF probabilities were still kind of west of that. So did anything else kind of sway your decision to draw those outlooks to include the entire, island and into southern Connecticut?
So some of that was actually connected to the global models, which still had a bit of a signal for heavier rainfall that was a bit farther north, especially when you start including the MBM and you start breaking down some of the individual global model components. There was still some signal for heavy rains farther up the coast towards southern New England, but ultimately the moderate risk upgrade in particular, that was really very HREF intensive as far as the decision making to do that, to try to have the greater New York City metropolitan area kind of near the epicenter, and that was very much tied into the probabilities, not to mention the trends that we were seeing from the HREF, which kind of went back up to the north as we got into the event itself.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. All right, so just touching on satellite, you talked a lot about the products, the Sierra products, and the 4 panels and looking at the different layers. Were you looking at that in real time, or was this just post analysis? And were there any other satellite products that are out there that show something similar? Because I know for forecasters, we don't get those products in AWeB, so we have to bring them up on our computer. Not all of them, but the one you showed, the 4 panel, I think it was the last slide. So just curious if you were using that in real time.
Yeah, so all of that was real time, especially for the MPD that we it's the series of MPDs that we put out for the event. The ALPW data itself was in our AWeBs. We had that at the time in our AWeB system. The experimental Sierra products, the LVT, the layered vapor transport, and also the percentile rankings, all of that is web based, and so we had that up on our PC, and so I had those bookmarks and was looking at that in real time.
Okay, yeah, that's great. It's always a good reminder to have those up, because sometimes you are so focused in AWeBs, warning and doing discussions and all of that, where helpful data could be right at your fingertips.
Yeah, I think for us, some of the precipitable water data, and that once you start to get into the event, we tend to focus more on the radar and those sorts of things, the 1 minute visible, 1 minute sandwich and those sorts of things. Maybe a little bit less on, once you got those 2-inch plus PWatts in, and you can see the stream is coming all the way up the coast. You kind of know, and so we tend not to rely on those as much once we get into the event, but certainly leading up to it.
All right, thank you. Okay, so I don't see any other questions jumping out at me, unless the team sees anything. I think I could pass it back over to Dan.
Yeah, I do see some questions in the chat.
Okay.
I'm not sure how it works exactly with Google Meet, but maybe, yeah, and I know we said we would end at 45 minutes after, so if anybody needs to take off, of course, they're welcome to. But for those who can stay on just a few more minutes to address the questions, I think that would be great. This has been a really nice presentation and discussion so far. So can you see the questions, Heather?
Yeah,
okay.
I had to scroll all the way up. So.
Okay, yeah, maybe if you want to, they're sort of mixed in there. If you want to grab a couple of those, and then before we end.
Okay, sounds good. All righty. Okay, so first question from John Forsyth. What changes might help to communicate flood threats? So like PDS type wording.
Yeah, that's a tough one, Dave.
Thank you for that. So I think, again, this in some ways, right, this is a low probability, high impact kind of message, right? Similar to something like a tornado, something like that. And I think, the best that we can do right now is continue to highlight the region, the amounts that we think are likely, that not everybody's going to see this, but there are going to be spots in this area that are going to see or may exceed this, and here's why. Rainfall rates expected of this, et cetera, et cetera. And as the event gets closer, obviously you can narrow that down a little bit more. But if you can't blast your entire area with 8 inches of rainfall possible. You don't want, nor would you want everybody preparing for that, because again, you got to keep in mind, when you're messaging this information, when you're sending out these briefings to your partners, they are taking actions based on that information. So it's a very fine line between preparedness and over warning, if you will, in a cost loss sort of way, I guess you could say. So, trying to pinpoint it the best we can as the event nears is our best approach, and trying to message the fact that someone's going to see, those amounts, and maybe assign some probabilities to it, some objective probabilities to it based on the information, is kind of what we try to do. Is it perfect? No. We had these events our office had these we had 500 to 1,000 year events this summer with no flood watch, and well east of where we had thought everything was going to set up. So the warnings were good, but the leading up to the event, not so good. So, the challenge remains, and, we continue to try to do the best we can with that and focus that in as the event gets close based on, mesoscale guidance and other things.
Okay, thank you. Okay, one question from Cole Stern. Hi, I'm a high school student investigating and studying flooding near Long Island. I was curious what prompted the South Nassau considerable tag during the event.
Yeah, I don't remember if I issued that or if Jay issued that, but at any rate, we were anticipating additional development to the south. That it was more preemptive than anything based on the trends that we were seeing and we're expecting to continue. So that's what prompted that expansion basically to the east of the considerable tag that day. We were also starting to see some impacts in southeastern Queens as well, in terms of flooded roadways, roads closed. I don't remember if we had stranded folks or not, but certainly the underpasses and things like that were not passable at that time. So that was more of a preemptive strike into southern Nassau, as I recall.
Yeah, I could see, being in a metropolitan area, it's probably easier to go that considerable tag versus a more rural area.
So and again, we got some questions after the event of why we didn't go all the way with a flash flood emergency.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where we utilized our deployed meteorologist down to OEM, who was getting reports real time of what was happening around the city. And, for an emergency, we had collaborated against that. There wasn't infrastructure damage. There was not, groups of people on cars getting rescued. It wasn't at that point quite yet. And so we had made that decision to hold off on there, which seems to have worked out pretty well. But, when you make these decisions, when you're dealing with these in real time in concert with the emergency managers, these are all things that you're, as you know, right, Heather, especially that you're trying to take into account in terms of these upgrades.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a good takeaway. Okay, Dan, I think I'm all set. There's a lot of talk in the chat, but there are no real questions, so I'm just going to leave it there.
Okay. Yeah, that's great, Heather. I am going to ask one more because
Okay.
I've been interested in this. So looking at the radar and the satellite presentation, clearly there were high rain rates, but I think that the duration component, in other words, getting sort of over and over sort of training echoes, played a big role in the ultimate rain totals. My question is, what do you look for besides just model QPF to anticipate training? Because, if the system had been just pushing a tiny bit to the east or had been oriented slightly differently, you probably wouldn't have had that same duration over these populated areas. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, we're looking at the flow, and we're looking at obviously the back building and development, in this case to the south, on a what is, during the event, on what is incoming, and trying to, for lack of a better phrase, advect that forward and what we're seeing, especially to the south and southwest, this particular event. But in this particular case, where does your convergence line up, and where is the flow, conducive to continued backbuilding of this type of convection? And that's kind of what we're looking at a meso-analyst framework, in these kinds of situations, to help inform those warnings and expansions of those as well in real time. That's a good question, Dan.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, go ahead, Andrew. Did you have something?
No, yeah, I was just going to add to that real quick. So, like, in addition to like the real-time observational data analysis that you're doing, you can also kind of compare that to what you're seeing with some of the HREF guidance itself. And like, for example, like the simulated radar reflectivity, you can also look at simulated satellite data as well. And that can really inform you a lot on what kind of potential you're going to be looking at, not only from a convective mode perspective, but you talk about persistence and the idea of having training. You can use those data sets all collectively, kind of inform that decision on, okay, well, like over the next 3 to 6 hours, we're really looking at this potential for training, given the current rates that are occurring. So you can sort of extrapolate out in time a bit there to sort of inform what kind of heavier totals you may get and how bad of an event it could be.
And one really quick addendum to that, that's one of the reasons, we're really excited about WAFs and some of these short-term ensembles that are high refresh, high frequency output that are going to help ideally, right, with some of this stuff in that 3 to 6 hour time frame in particular. So we're looking forward to that as well.
All right. Well, this is a good place to end it. You can blame me for going past our end time. But first of all, I'd like to thank Andrew and Dave for a tremendous presentation, and of course, Heather for doing an excellent job with the facilitation during today's discussion. As we previously mentioned, please remember in a week that Kevin Thiel, research meteorologist from CIRO and the GOES-R satellite liaison to SBC and HWT, is going to discuss last year's HWT. That's 1 week from now. And so that ends the session. Thanks a lot for everybody for joining us this time.